Good morning, ED 5316. As promised, I wanted to share a presentation with you that reviews all of the material that we've been talking about this semester. You're near the end of our course this semester, and I'm hoping that our final activities will help you grow as an educator toward improving learning experience for diverse learners. The purpose of this presentation is just to really talk about some of the key takeaways and to help you think about what topic you will research this next week to begin writing about one of the many issues that we discussed this semester. So the theme throughout all of our readings and videos and activities that we've participated in this semester really looks at this idea of multiculturalism and pluralism. We'll talk about that a little bit today. And diversity, which really requires that we as individual educators learn about other cultures and learn how to be open to different beliefs and perspectives, not only for ourselves, but to assist others as leaders in facilitating learning experiences so that people from other cultures feel represented, and that we build systems within our institutions that promotes this idea of multiculturalism and diversity, celebrating learning for all, and really maximizing the potential of all of our learners. So it's this belief that all students can learn, all students have value, and it's this not only belief and value system, but also the ability to facilitate learning experiences so that within the institution itself we are not only learning about other cultures, but also allowing for students to showcase or share their perspectives in a mutually respectful way. So it's this idea of looking at beliefs versus values that we talked about in chapter 1 of our readings, and how our beliefs form our attitudes or perspectives and values, and that leads to action. So, and how all of that is interconnected. So it's important to recognize that all of us have bias. We all carry bias with us, but learning how to put ourselves in check and to really build a culture where we recognize and respect people from different perspectives or beliefs, and provide a platform so that communication and collaboration doesn't require that everybody agree, but that we celebrate disagreement and discourse, which produces critical thinkers, and that is very necessary in our global economy. So we need to recognize that we all have bias, and then how do we as educators think about bias? What bias exists in our schools? What bias exists in our communities? What types of stereotypes do we see in our culture? What types of prejudices exist, and how have labels been used to hinder the progress of diverse learners? How widespread is this prejudice in our community? And is this a global phenomenon, or is this an American-only education issue? And as we learn, global biases, stereotypes, prejudices, labels, those are used all around the world. And so what we want to do here in our system as a 21st century learning exchange is to recognize that there are biases and try to inform, to educate, to really think about, okay, what types of biases are we projecting, what stereotypes exist in this community, what prejudices are there, and to refrain from using labels as we talk about how to best meet the needs of our diverse learners. So, we we want to not dismiss students, parents, community members due to our prejudices. And often in school communities, we do that without realizing it sometimes. I don't think educators, I think most educators really want to make a difference, a positive difference in their communities, but sometimes we fail to recognize how we may dismiss stakeholders in our community, the haves and the have-nots. We see this often where school boards only represent a minority of the community, an elite group, and isn't representative of the student population of that particular community. So we don't want to create a culture where we dismiss with prejudice different viewpoints and different belief systems. And so we have to, as leaders, recognize that we must build collaborative systems within our organizations. And this is a new model moving forward. And that looks very different. So how we communicate matters. And there are many communication misconceptions that we learned about this semester. And, we must think, what is the message and who is receiving the message? Okay, do they speak English? What are their belief systems? Do they feel comfortable in the school atmosphere, or is it better to maybe meet them in a community partnership place, organization where they feel comfortable? Is it appropriate for us to visit their homes? Do they welcome that? So really how we go about communicating with our diverse populations matters. And we really talked a lot this semester about the models of communication. So really, this can't be an us versus them approach. One of the visuals in our book looked at a circular model of communications where communications is both verbal and nonverbal actions. It's also our attitude toward groups, observations and assumptions of groups, conclusions and judgments that the organization has made, or the institution has made as a whole, or you as a whole. Verbal, nonverbal action, attitudes, observations and assumptions and conclusions and judgments exist in both spectrums, with the individual and the other group, the institution and the other group. So we must recognize that our attitude towards people or groups might create conflict, and you as a leader will need to consider how the message is delivered, but also how the message is perceived. Really, your perceptions, I've heard this a lot, perceptions really are the reality. You may not have intended for the message to be perceived a certain way, but you have to really think about the other group's perspective. And so that's really important to do as we move forward. So there are different communication styles, and we discussed this in detail in regard to race, gender, sexual orientation, and disability. And so understanding how we communicate to these and the style of communication needed to address these different types of diverse learners is really important. And you really have to talk about this as a staff. You can't just assume that your faculty understands these communication skill sets. And so one that I really want to touch on is the zero tolerance policies. We did discuss this semester in the text and in our readings. But remember, we learned that such policies of zero tolerance actually have a negative effect in our learning environment. So we see an increased dropout rate. This is research showing this. Decreased student morale, and a lower academic achievement. So a better approach we learned about this semester in regard to conflict and diversity is this idea of conflict resolution and what that looks like. So approaching discipline in the classroom or as a leader, not using a zero tolerance policy, maybe approaching it through conflict resolution, using those skill sets that we talked about during this semester, requires skill sets where educators are rational. We avoid personal attacks, personal criticism. We encourage collaboration and contributions from all perspectives. And when you're listening to the other party, we restate ideas. That's a skill set that, so that requires listening to the other person and then restating what you heard them say. That also validates their opinion, okay, and kind of eases the tension in the room. And then we focus on a resolution, not the conflict itself. So these are all skill sets that can be taught, and we need to review as a faculty in our schools and organizations. So some of the issues that we discuss in Chapter 4, we really looked at this idea of immigration. This is such a timely topic, right? Immigration and language barriers, and this whole idea of bilingual education. And what we want to remember that was in Chapter 4, we learned that it's important to foster assimilation, not prevent it. And we do this through bilingual education. Bilingual education values learning diversity and also values multiple cultural perspectives. As a literacy professor, I also recognize that this also values literacy because we know that bilingual children are often literate in their first language and have issues in the second language. So recent research supports that bilingual education for English language learners can really help their academic growth and achievement. So we also talked this semester about issues facing our ELL learners and our Indigenous learners, and I really want to highlight this because there are 5 areas where I think we have issues, and this might be a topic that you might be interested in researching. So one topic you might research is this idea of bilingual education that we just talked about. Another one might be issues facing Indigenous learners, which could be the devaluing of Indigenous teachings. They have their own curriculum and their own approach, and our current system often devalues that approach. Also, there's institutionalized racism that exists targeting these groups. We learned about that this semester. There is discouragement of celebrating Indigenous languages and identity. And how do we preserve this language and this culture, this history, this rich history? Because it's being lost right now. And so I think respecting that and creating systems that celebrate that, those outlets where young learners are learning about how to use their language and their identity is really important. Also, the whitewashing of history. We watched a video about this. And so what is their historical perspective is being lost, and I think it's important that we think about that. And then the low graduation and enrollment rates is a real issue in our current system. So what about religion? This might be another topic that you might want to hit upon. What can schools do and not do in regards to religious freedoms? And I think it's important, often we hear people in the community, talk about these topics, and I'm always often very surprised about the lack of knowledge about what we can and cannot do. So we learned this semester that schools can allow non-disruptive individual